Hello winemakers, welcome back to my YouTube channel called My Backyard Vineyard. My name is Grant Kramer and I'm a professor emeritus at the University of Nevada, Reno. But this is not my backyard vineyard, this is my garage where I have my home winery. And I'm going to take the grapes that I processed from the last episode and show you a step-by-step process of how I fermented the grapes to make a rosé wine. Fermentation is an exciting process where the yeast convert all the sugar into alcohol.
Fermentation is where we really see the incredible biology at work. Tiny yeast cells growing, dividing, and feasting on sugar, transforming sweetness into something deliciously complex and intoxicating. They dance in the dark, bubbling away, creating alcohol and carbon dioxide. It's a delicate balance, a celebration of decay and rebirth. In that process, a simple grape becomes a symphony of fruity aromas and flavors with mouthfeel and texture. Yummy!
So sit back and maybe grab a glass of rosé and watch and enjoy the process of making rosé wine. Unlike making regular wines that are red wines where you ferment the grapes on the skins, in rosé you want to get the grapes off the skins as quickly as possible. Some people leave the skins on for 2, maybe even 12 hours to extract a little bit more color. So it's dependent upon the winemaker and what sort of rosé that they're trying to make. Some rosés come out a pink or a salmon pink or even a deeper red, but it's a lighter red than a red wine. And even some rosés have an orangish tinge to them, depending on the grape and the conditions and the amount of extraction.
So let's get started with the juice that has been sitting overnight after the day of harvest. The potassium metabisulfite has stunned the wild yeast and it's ready to be introduced with a new yeast. I've chosen to start my fermentation of my Pinot Noir rosé wine with Lalvin 71B yeast, which is a well-known yeast used in making Pinot Noir wines and rosés. This 5-gram packet works perfectly for 5 gallons of wine. Before hydrating the yeast, one wants to add GoFerm to the water prior to adding the yeast. GoFerm is a rehydration nutrient which enhances the fermentation kinetics of the yeast and helps prevent fermentation problems. In lukewarm water, it takes yeast about 15 minutes to become fully active. They need time to hydrate and get their membranes in proper shape. The fermentation is starting to get active.
You can start to see some bubbles forming in it. And later, about 12 hours from now this evening, I will add some Fermaid K, which will add even more nutrients for the yeast and make them grow healthy. Okay, it's been about 15 minutes. We can see some activity still going on here. A little bit more activity than before. You can see the layers starting to develop here as the yeast have been hydrated. It's time to add the yeast to the juice. Now everything that goes in to my juice must be treated with star sand. So I have a bucket of star sand. I'm going to use this big spoon here to stir my juice and mix the yeast in with it. So all you have to do is dip it in and it's sanitized. Okay, we have the yeast here. Just going to give it a little stir with a spoon. I'm going to pour it into the juice. And I'm going to rinse that extra yeast off of my spoon into the juice. And the container as well. Get that yeast all in there. And then we're going to give it a little stir.
we're going to add the lid back down. This pump
causes this inner tube to swell up. And we'll hold this airtight seal here above. I've left the lid a little bit higher than the juice so that there's room for fermentation to go without hitting the lid. And we have a airlock built into the lid right here that has a little marble in here, and as the pressure builds up from the CO2 from the fermentation, it'll blow out of this airlock but not let air into it. And this has a little hook on it, which we'll just use to hang on the side of the fermentation tank. The length of the fermentation is usually 5 days to 2 weeks. It's dependent upon the temperature. So if it's warmer, the fermentation will go faster. If it's cooler, the fermentation goes slow. The start of the second day of fermentation. The foam ferment is going well.
Hydrometers and thermometers are useful for making measurements in the juice and the must. One must use the hydrometer to measure the sugar content, as a refractometer will be distorted by the alcohol in the must as it develops and give an inaccurate reading of the true sugar levels.
Reading of somewhere around 27. Day 3 of the ferment. Not so much foam. We'll see how this is going. Shell's yeasty though.
If you look at the numbers, the specific gravity and sugar have been dropping steadily, and the temperatures have stayed elevated as they should when the fermentation is going. The purpose of making these measurements is to know that the fermentation is going along steadily, which it is. My particular hydrometer measures sugars in ounces per gallon. We can see that the numbers have decreased from 36 to 11. So it's time to transfer the wine into the carboys. I want to complete the fermentation in the carboys, as there will be less risk of exposing the wine to oxygen. I will also add a second dose of fermented K in the transfer process into the carboys to provide extra nutrients for the yeast. This lift is very handy for moving heavy objects in the winery, as you'll see here. Sanitize, sanitize, sanitize. It's important to sanitize the equipment every time you're going to use them. Sanitizing is important to prevent the development of wine faults. As I said earlier, Star San is a good sanitizer that does not need to be rinsed with water after it's used. It will not affect the wine. Again, the lift makes it very easy to transfer the wine gravimetrically from the tank and into the carboy. Whoops, I almost forgot to add the second dose of fermented K, but it's not too late. I'll mix it into the tank and then it'll blend in with the new wine blending into the carboy to provide a uniform nutrient for the yeast. The French have found that by adding fermented K to the wine at this lower sugar level, it helps to prevent against wine faults by preventing the yeast from being stressed. It's important to measure the amount of fermented K by weighing very accurately, and then to hydrate the fermented K before adding it to the wine. I'm rotating the tank a little bit to mix in the fermented K. The fermentation is still active, so I don't want to put too much wine in the carboy or I may blow off my airlock with too much pressure. I'm going to transfer the last bit into the 3-gallon carboy. And this is what is left at the bottom of the tank, just a little bit of yeast residue that will need to be cleaned out afterwards. I'm setting my 2 carboys on my stainless steel table where the fermentation will continue. It's time to install the airlocks, but first they must be sanitized. I'm going to leave a little sanitizer in the airlock so that they protect it from the air and prevent bugs from floating in to the wine. Once the airlocks are placed on, you should be able to see pressure pushing the liquid up and out of the tank and pushing the liquid upwards as seen here. Eventually the pressure will build up enough in the carboy to make the airlocks bubble, as seen here on the right and here on the left.
You can see the foam building up on the carboys, so the fermentation's still going. The airlocks have pressure in them, as seen by the distinction in the levels and then the bubbling that is occurring. And we'll watch for the fermentation to stop by watching when the bubbles stop happening. And then I'll combine these 2 carboys to fill them up to the top to keep the air off the top of the carboys. We want as narrow a surface area as possible, so we'll try to get that right up here to the neck.
4 hours later, we can see that the fermentation is much more active, as evidenced by the foam on the top, on the left, and even on the right to some extent. A little bit of yeast on the bottom as well. These represent dead yeast, but don't worry, the yeast are actively divided and making new ones all the time. The old ones die and settle out.
Bubbling has really slowed down. And you can see in the right tank, there's not so much foam on the top. But at the bottom, there's a lot more yeast building up. So still bubbling, but at a much slower rate. Okay, fermentation is almost completely stopped. You can see a few little bubbles at the top, and occasionally the airlocks bubble, but not very often. So there's just a slight amount of finish to go. We can see most of the yeast have died, and we can see on the surface there's a few bubbles, a little bit of foam. So there's still a little bit happening. But as you can see, I think we've only had one bubble in the airlocks during this whole course of the video.
The fermentation continues to slow down and the yeast continue to die, and the wine becomes clearer as they settle out. Fermentation temperature is quite important, and as you recall, my fermentation temperatures were between 24 and 27 degrees centigrade. That is between 75 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit, which is really too warm to be making a white wine or a rosé, where we want more fruity aromas produced. Cooler fermentation temperatures provide fruitier wines, and warmer temperatures for fermentation are good for extraction of color, so red wines are usually fermented at much warmer temperatures. On top of that, my garage, although insulated, fluctuates with temperature as the weather changes, and right now we're experiencing a heat wave. There are a variety of ways in which one can control the temperature of the fermentation, such as using glycol jacketed fermenters, which are very expensive, or ice baths in your garage, or even refrigeration.
So my Marchisio 100-liter tanks will fit very nicely inside of my refrigerator in my garage. And this is a way in the future I can control the temperature of my fermentation by adjusting the temperature a few degrees below the temperature of the ferment to bring down the temperature and control it. And I can monitor it with this thermometer here.
Hopefully my rosé wine this year comes out just fine. However, I do want to experiment more in the future with cooler temperatures and see how it impacts the quality of my wines. Well, I brought the wines into my house where the temperatures were cooler, as the heat wave is destined to go on for several days. And you can see that the wines are continuing to clarify here. The fermentation has completely stopped. There are no signs of bubbling of any kind. The sediments at the bottom of the tank are known as the lees. Those are the dead yeast. And it doesn't hurt the wine to sit on them for a little while, as it will add body and texture to the wine. However, we want to continue the clarification process by racking off the wine. That is the next step in this process of winemaking. For those of you who are interested in this handy little lift, here are a few photos of the details of this lift. In the next video, I will demonstrate how we clarify and protect the rosé wine from oxidation as it ages over the winter months in the carboy. This involves racking of the wines along with further potassium metabisulfite additions. I will show several options for racking and a method for measuring your SO2 concentrations.
Well, that's it. If you like this video, then please like it on my YouTube channel, where you'll find other interesting videos on winemaking practices, which is, if you want to know more details about the winemaking practices in this video, see my Wine Science series, where I go into a lot more detail about making wines. And there are other videos on grape growing or viticulture, and even plant physiology. Well, here's to rosé, a toast to you and our future wines together. Yummy. I like rosé. Have a great day.